Okay, well, video number 2 in the series. In this video, I'm going to talk about the boil. The boil is one of the most important parts of the brew process. I mean, they're all important parts, but the boil is where you do a lot of different things to get your beer to the flavor that you want to end up with. You've got your recipe, you had your grain bill figured out, you had the different types of grain mixed in so you get good flavor of the wort, but now you're going to add bitterness to that wort, and you're going to boil off and get rid of some things that you don't want in your final wort when you go into the fermenter. Now, before you boil and before you do everything, you want to make sure you start with clean systems. When you're doing stuff pre-boil, your mash tun, your boil kettle, anything you use prior to the boil, you just need to do a really good soap and water rinse and clean of all your equipment. After the boil, you got to do a really good sanitization of your equipment, because after the boil, you could possibly introduce some bacteria and some other bugs that can hurt your beer. Before the boil, during the boil, that's not quite so important because you're boiling, and the boil is going to kill anything that might show up. So get everything really clean and have your area pretty clean. You don't want to brew where you got a mess or you're stirring up dust, because that can have some effect on your beer. So anyway, I'm going to look at my notes here, see what I can remember. Okay. In the last video I talked about boil off rate. The boil off rate is the amount of wort that's evaporated during the boil process. Now on my system, I typically calculate about a 2 gallon an hour boil off rate. I've got an electric system here, and it can boil pretty full, and it can get rid of the moisture pretty fast. In fact, in my brewery area here, I've got a tarp here. You can't really see it, I don't think, but I hang the tarp across here, and I've got a window with 2 box fans in it to get all the moisture out, and I've actually put some plastic on the ceiling of the area, so all that moisture that's in the air can get out of here and not go all over my house. You're going to evaporate some water. There's no doubt about it. So here I figure 2 gallons. When I'm brewing with gas, I usually figure somewhere between 1.5 gallons and 1.75 gallons. Not quite 2 gallons, but fairly close. I also figure that I'm going to lose at least a quart that's going to be left behind in my boil kettle when I'm draining it. I probably will lose between a quart and maybe 1/2 gallon in the fermenter once everything's done and all the yeast and the trub is settled. So that's all part of your calculations that you need to do from the beginning, is make sure you have enough water. The boil is important because the boil allows you to do some things to your wort that you couldn't do without boiling it. There are really like 7 different things that the boil does. And I'm just going to go through a list here of what they are. First thing, as I just mentioned, the boil sterilizes the wort, gets rid of anything that's left that might have been in the grain that the 150 degree temperatures you mashed at hasn't killed. The boil will kill all those organisms. It also, if for some reason your grain was not fully converted and the starches didn't turn to sugars all the way, or there might be a few leftovers, it will stop that starch conversion. So any enzymatic activity that's still going on, the boil's going to stop. The boil, as it boils off the moisture, concentrates. It will turn the gravity from what might be like 1.030 at the beginning of the boil up to 1.050 or higher when the boil is finished. So once that moisture is evaporated off, the sugars remain and they get more concentrated. A longer boil can even concentrate the sugars into caramel and caramelize them some. I've heard of people doing as long as a 2-hour boil with different things. The boil also lets you add some other adjuncts that you couldn't add at lower temperature. You can add different sugars. If you're making Belgians, you can add Belgian candy sugar. If you're making something like a wee heavy, you might want to add some brown sugar. If you're making a honey wheat, you might want to add some honey. I mean, the boil is a good place to do that because it will, just the boil process will thin those sugars out in the wort, and it'll distribute them throughout the wort. One of the most important things that a boil does is it gets rid of off flavors and off volatiles that are present that you want to get rid of before you start fermenting. The most important one of these is dimethyl sulfide. The dimethyl sulfide, or DMS, can give you a creamed corn-like flavor and aroma. It's not very pleasant, and it's not something you want in your beer. During the boil, you get rid of the DMS, much like during fermentation, at the end of fermentation, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the next video, you might raise the temperature to do a diacetyl rest. And now the diacetyl rest gets rid of buttery flavors that might be present in your final beer. Anyway, another important part of the boil is that it coagulates the proteins that are in the liquid that's extracted from the grain in your mash process. You don't want those proteins in your beer. When you boil, you'll notice like cloudy cotton candy type things in the wort as you're boiling it or after you're boiling it. Well, that's a coagulation of the proteins that have been extracted out of the grain. You don't want that going into your fermenter. Then, as I said before, excuse me, it changes the flavor of the wort by virtue of the heat and the timing. It can caramelize the wort. It can change the color of the wort and turn it from a light color to a darker color due to different changes that happen when you're boiling. And finally, again, one of the most important parts is that when you're boiling, you can add hops to the beer and give it some bitterness and some hoppy flavoring. It wouldn't be beer without hops. I mean, at least most beers wouldn't be beer without hops. So the boil is where you add your hops to your beer. Now, when you add hops to the boil, hops that you add at the beginning of the boil that are extracted or have their stuff extracted out longer give you bitterness. And the boiling process takes some of the oils and it evaporates them out of the hops and doesn't give it as much flavor as hops added at the end of the boil. So beginning boil hops are used for bitterness, end of boil hops are used for flavor. So you got to remember that. If you like the flavor of a specific hop and that's what you want your beer to taste like, add it at the end. Brewers also do things called dry hopping. Dry hopping is when you add hops to fermentation. And what happens is the fermentation, whether it be during high krausen or at the end of fermentation, will extract the oils out of those hops without volatilizing them and getting rid of them. Now you do lose some of the aroma if you add hops during the fermentation process when it's really going good, that you might not lose if you add it later on when fermentation has started to die down. But that's, again, we'll talk about that more in fermentation. But anyway, boiling is where you put your hops in. Now, the type of boil is very important. I mentioned you're boiling to get rid of the volatiles and the DMS and other flavors that might be in the beer that will go away if you boil it. You want a really good rolling boil. It doesn't have to be a crazy boil where everything's going on. You just want a nice, good rolling boil, and enough to where you're creating some steam, you're creating a little bit of oxygen release in that boil, and all that DMS is going away. So a good rolling boil for a good period of time. Let's see. One thing you should do when you're boiling is take gravity readings periodically. Now you always want to take a gravity reading at the beginning of the boil. That tells you how good your sugar extraction was during the mash process. Pretty much every brewing piece of software out there will tell you what you could expect to get out of the grains you're using during the mash process. Well, or what the optimal amount of sugars that would come out of the grains during the mash process. The testing of gravity at the beginning of the boil tells you how you did. Now, some grain extracts sugars better than other. The more roasted a grain is, the less sugars there are left for it to pull out. Like a dark, highly roasted barley that's like 300 to 500 SRM, that's not going to have very many sugars in it. The flavors it pulls out of that are going to be more roasty, coffee-like flavors. But two-row, that might not be roasted nearly as much, has a whole bunch of sugars in it, and you can expect it to pull the sugars out at a certain rate. The brewing programs know this. As part of what they put in when they key in their sugar, their grains in the pull downs, where you tell it what kind of grain you're using, is how much sugar you can expect to extract out of that grain. So they give you an estimate after your recipe has been designed of what your gravity should be and what you can expect to end up with. So taking gravity readings during the process helps you to compare what you got with what they expected you to get. Now, you're never going to be perfect. It's never going to be exact. Don't worry about it. You're going to get what you're going to get. When you're done, you're going to end up with beer. Okay? And it'll probably end up being a good beer, even if your gravity readings are 5 or 10 points off, or end up a little higher or a little lower than what you expected. Don't worry about it. There are a lot of things that can cause that. There could be things such as the crush of the grain. It might not have been crushed fine enough, or it might have been crushed too fine. It could be things like your mash temperature. You may have mashed higher than what you thought you did, and maybe your thermometer might be off. With my electric brewing equipment, I have to actually take my sensors and calculate them. And I have a good thermometer that I know is accurate, and I compare and contrast my good thermometer with what the sensor in the kettle says, and I adjust the electronics so that they're even. So if you mash a little bit higher than you thought you were mashing at, you're not going to extract as many sugars, so your gravity is not going to go as low as you might expect it would. The other thing holds true if you mash at a lower temperature and your gravity you expect it to be at 1015 and it goes down to 1005. You're getting a whole lot more alcohol out of that. It is going to change the flavor and feel of your beer, but that could be because you weren't mashing at a high enough temperature. It could also be caused by boiling off not enough or boiling off too much. If you don't have your volumes correct, and at the end of an hour you ended up with 6.5 gallons of wort, and you were only supposed to end up with 6 gallons of wort, well, you got a half a gallon of wort that's got sugars in it that should have been concentrated down into that 6 gallons of wort to give you the gravity that you wanted. Now, if that happens, you just pretty much need to go with it. And it's a lot easier if you end up below what you expect than if you end up above what you expect. You can always add more water. You can boil for a little while longer to get rid of some of that excess moisture and get down to the volume you're supposed to be, but then that can affect your hops. As I said before, if you add hops at the beginning, you're going to get bitterness. If you add them at the end, you're going to get flavor. Well, if you've just added your flavor hops and you were expected to add them at 5 minutes left in the boil or at the end of the boil, and then you go ahead and have to boil it another half hour to evaporate off a half gallon of moisture, then those 5-minute hops just turned into 30-minute hops, and you've just lost some of that flavor. So again, that's why it's important for you to know your volumes. If you end up with less wort at the end, you can always just boil a gallon of water or a couple quarts of water and pour it in, and you're good to go. So that's an easy way to fit. And then you'll end up with the right starting gravity, and you'll end up with a beer that you expected or that you hope to get from your recipe. So again, it's really important to know your volumes. Let's see. The final thing After checking your gravities, you check the gravity at the beginning of the boil and you check the gravity at the end of the boil, and that end of the boil gravity gives you your starting gravity for fermentation, or your original gravity. You got a start of boil gravity, you got your original gravity, and then at the end of fermentation you got your final gravity. The difference between the original or starting gravity and the final gravity is going to be how much alcohol the sugar was converted into. And you would plug that into a formula in your brewing program, and it'll tell you what your ABV is. Pretty simple. The formula is out there online if you want to do it manually. I plug it in. There are also calculators online that do it too. For all this stuff, there are calculators online. You just have to find them. Now, at the end of the boil, you want to chill your wort down to fermentation temperature. Now, it's important to chill it down as fast as you can. Now, as fast as you can be anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, hour and 15 minutes. It's not going to make a huge difference, but the longer it's at a temperature between 175 and 120, that's the prime temperature range for things to show up in your beer that you don't want showing up in your beer. Bacterial growth, dust in the air going in, stuff that can cause sourness, stuff that can infect your beer. It's really important to get your beer down to a pitchable temperature, or at least a temperature under 110 or around 100 as fast as you can. Now, there are different ways to chill your wort, and I'll talk about a couple of them. The first way, and the one way that most people starting out do, is using this thing, and it's called an immersion chiller. Now, what this is a coil of copper with two ends on it, and I've got some quick connects on there. And what you do is you run cold water through this coil while it's sitting in your hot beer. And then you stir the beer around so that the beer goes around the coils, and the heat transfers from the beer to this coil and gets extracted out of the beer, and into the heat gets extracted out of the beer and dispersed through the water that comes out the other end of this. If you're going to use an immersion chiller, you want to make sure that you put it in your boil kettle with about 10 minutes left in the boil so that it sanitizes. Again, things after the boil need to be sanitized. Things before the boil need to be really clean. So you dump this, you clean it, you put it in your boil, let it sanitize, and use it to cool. Now, when I boil at the end of my boil, I usually do a process called whirlpooling. Now, what whirlpooling is stirring your beer around, and I use my pump to do it, and it creates a circular motion in the beer, and it creates a little vortex in the middle from the circular motion. And what happens is a lot of crap moves to the middle of the bottom and settles out. And then when you transfer it into your fermenter, you can leave all that crap behind. It gets the most out of your wort. It's a little harder to do with this, but it can be done. Again, I have a pump, so I use my pump. Another way to chill wort is a thing called a counterflow chiller. Now, this is my counterflow chiller. Now, if you'll notice, there are 4 connectors in this. 2 of them are standard hose connectors, these 2 here, and 2 of them are quick connects, much like the ones that were on the immersion chiller. Now, what this is really a tube inside a tube. I have a copper tube, and you can see it starts right here. That copper tube runs all the way through this garden hose from one end of it to the other, and it comes out in the other end right here. Now, so that's a tube inside the tube. On the outside of that tube, with the garden hose, I've got these fittings that I can run water through, and the water I run through here surrounds the inner tube, and it does the same thing as the immersion chiller. I mean, as the wort is going through the inner tube, it cools it, from one end to the other. Now, the reason it's called a counterflow chiller is because the end that the cold water goes in is the end where the hot wort comes out of the kettle. So what happens is cold water goes in here. Let me get this right. Cold water goes in here, hot wort comes out here. Or actually cool wort goes out here. Water comes out the other end, and the hot wort goes in there. And what happens is as the wort counterflows against the water, same thing happens as with the chiller, the other chiller. The heat is transferred from the inner tube to the outer water, and then it's expelled at the other end. Counterflow chillers are great. You really don't, you can chill the wort in real time, so to speak. I mean, it could be going in hot on this end and coming out 110 degrees cooler in the other end and go right into your fermenter. These are great as long as you get your flow rate set right. You don't want your flow rate being faster than the heat transfer rate. So the final way of chilling, and a way that a lot of new brewers do, is an ice bath. They take their brewing kettle, stick it in a sink full of ice, and just let the sink cool it. Stir it around. You could even whirlpool it in there while it's in the sink, and the wort chills. And so those are the three methods of chilling. When you're done chilling, then it's time you transfer it out of your boil kettle and into your fermentation vessel, and that's going to be the next video. So anyway, I hope I answered some questions and helped to explain the process and why we do what we do. Again, it's brewing. Things do happen. You're going to make mistakes. You might not hit your gravity. Your temperature of your mash might be a little high or low. You might end up with beer in your fermenter at 100 degrees instead of the 70 degrees you wanted it at for pitching. If that happens, just let it sit, let it cool. Again, you're out of the danger zone, so just let it take its time to cool down. If you have to, wait till the next morning to pitch your yeast. You don't necessarily have to pitch your yeast immediately. So, but that leads me into the next video, which is going to be fermentation, and I'm going to talk about yeast. I'm going to talk about cleanliness. I'm going to talk about the fermentation process. So stay tuned, and I appreciate you watching it. Thanks.